thank you all for sharing personal medical stories. It's not an easy thing to do, and I appreciate your willingness to do so because it's compelling. I can talk about this issue, but when real-life New Jerseyans talk about their challenges, then it is a far more consequential as we are trying to create both public opinion and advocacy. So I appreciate you're all willing to share your personal stories. And you know, whether it's 15,000 or 60,000
Yeah.
or 90,000, is that what the figure was? It's obviously, you know, way too high. And when I was listening to some of you say that you either don't qualify or just qualify for the manufacturer's assistance, of course none of that deals with the reality that there's still a very significant cost to the individual, that there are other choices to be made in life as a result of not having the resources, and whether that's losing your home, which is a really tough thing after working hard to build it, or constraining yourself or your ability to help your families in the future, as well as your own personal retirement possibilities. These are life choices that are only made in this case because of the cost of prescription drugs. So I have heard similar stories at different times, which is why there's a couple of things we're doing. And there's one thing I want to anecdotally mention that you mentioned you were concerned about the return of lifetime caps. That's something that, I am so proud of my work under the Affordable Care Act as one of the writers of the Affordable Care Act, because one of the things that we did is eliminate lifetime caps, which prior to the law in insurance, whether you had private insurance or whether you were on a government program, if you had a significant illness, like some of those fellow New Jerseyans who are here today that are talking about their challenges, if you had a significant illness and you hit that cap, that ceiling on how much the insurance company would cover, and you still had the illness and you're still dealing with trying to get better or to stay alive, then you'd go above that. And once you went above that, you were totally on your own. And so eliminating lifetime caps, which the Affordable Care Act did, as well as ending discriminations against pre-existing conditions, was one of the critical parts of the law. And while the law isn't perfect, these are some of the most significant consumer protections we had. So I understand when you say you're thinking about, because right now the Trump administration is in a federal court arguing that the Affordable Care Act, and particularly some of these provisions, are unconstitutional, instead of standing up to keep the law. Now, the law could be improved upon, but we don't end up making life better for people by ultimately taking away that which is protections that exist under the law today. So, many of us are joining in briefs to the court to say, no, the law was passed by Congress, signed by a president. We believe all of its elements are constitutional and critically important, including preserving lifetime, eliminating the lifetime caps, and preserving the protections against pre-existing condition discrimination. So, so even as we are talking about prescription drugs, this is an issue that can affect that as well. There's a couple of pieces of legislation that I am advocating for strongly. One is called the CREATES Act, which is in essence to stop the roadblocks that many companies, we want pharmaceutical companies to develop new life-saving, life-enhancing drugs, but at the same time we give them a patent for a period of time. That allows them to charge and get money over time to recoup the investments they make and of course make a profit. But after that period of time is over, they're supposed to allow other pharmaceutical companies, particularly generic companies, to go ahead and get samples and then develop a generic alternative, which is always cheaper, sometimes less cheaper, but sometimes still, in many cases, much, much cheaper. And that means that the patient has a greater access at a more affordable cost. What's happening is that many companies are fighting tooth and nail to stop the generic from coming to the marketplace, not giving access to their samples. So the CREATES Act actually would clear the hurdles for generic companies to be able to get the access so that they can offer a cheaper, viable alternative to patients. I think that's very important. It's a bipartisan piece of legislation. We're also sponsoring something we call the Spike Act, which is if a company is going to dramatically raise the cost of a drug, then it's going to have to justify it. Because if you're charging one price for a period of time and all of a sudden you go 200% up, well, why? Is there some new ingredient or some ingredient that you now can't get that's more expensive, or is it just about putting profits over patients? And that shouldn't be tolerated. And so the Spike Act now creates, if we had it pass into law, would insist that there be a justification, and that justification would have to be approved before any such increase could take place. We're also working on the donut hole, which for seniors obviously is an important one. We're closing that donut hole. Last year in this budget that we passed, we closed it 1 year quicker. It's going to be closed in a few more years totally. But this is when you have prescription drug costs and then you go to a certain point, you don't longer have any coverage, you fall through, and only when you get beyond a certain amount do you get back coverage again. Well, that coverage should be consistent throughout the process because people don't lose the necessity for life-saving drugs, so they still have to pay for it. And these are challenges. The other thing is that we're pursuing legislation so that when you go to your pharmacist, the pharmacist is not blocked from telling you that there's actually an alternative that's cheaper. And some companies, when they sell drugs to the pharmacy, will have limitations, almost like a gag rule, that they can't join in telling the patient about, well, you know, there is an alternative here, and that alternative is significantly cheaper. Can't do that. That is fundamentally wrong. In our society, we enjoy open and transparent information, and we make decisions based upon that. So we want to end that gag rule. So those are some of the things that we're doing to try to push back and try to create lower costs. And my concern is that if at the end of the day you have a drug that can keep you alive, but you can't afford it, that's not the promise. It doesn't hold the promise that it's intended for. So we need to make sure that when someone, either to improve the quality of their life, to be able to stay alive, to fulfill their life, especially as they're younger, shouldn't ultimately come up against the impossibility of paying it without dramatic life consequences. So we're going to continue to work on this issue, and I appreciate all of your willingness to instruct us. The program that the doctor mentioned is one that creates, from a federal perspective, and access particularly for certain institutions to get access to those drugs at lower costs based upon the universe that they're serving. But at the end of the day, you know, I'd like that to be a reality across the board for people. So thank you very much for sharing your stories, and I appreciate your willingness to do so. I know it's not easy, but it is powerful in terms of the issue we want to make and the opportunities we want to change the course of events for the better here.